Hello. Here we are. Really happy to be introducing our next guest. He had listened to our podcast and then reached out to us, and his story was really interesting. And he's also an author. So let me introduce Ed Di Gangi. Hi, Ed.
Good
Hi,
morning. It's nice to
Ed.
be here with both of you.
We're so
Nice
excited.
to have you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So tell us just a bit. Give us your adoption story. We'll probably break in and ask some questions, but just out the gate, tell us your adoption story.
Sure. I think I've actually got a rather unusual adoption story in that I'm now approaching, I'm 73 and a half. And I was adopted at birth. I was brought home by my adoptive parents at a day old. And my adoption was privately arranged. So this goes back to the baby scoop era where people were kind of sent off and hidden and then returned home and the baby's taken from them. This was a very different story in that my mother was able to manage the pregnancy, manage the adoption herself and what she wanted for her child. And the benefit that was ultimately left with me was documentation of my adoption, which my adoptive parents held on to. The unusual part from their side is I have no recollection at any age of them ever having discussed adoption with me.
Wow.
And, my wife tells me that she and my mother had a conversation at one point, and my mother said, "Oh, sure, I used to tell him because the doctor instructed us, hold your baby, cuddle them, and tell them that you are my wonderful adopted baby." And my mother apparently did that until I was 2 years old and had no understanding of what she was saying, and then stopped.
So you didn't know you were adopted?
No, I had no conversation with my parents to advise me of that. There probably a small handful or a couple of things that occurred that made me curious. One, when I was about 7 years old, my family went to Europe, and we were in France and went to an orphanage there. And I was kind of curious about what we were doing there. And my mother and father said, "Wouldn't you like a little sister?" And I thought I was having a pretty good time as an only kid. And number one, I really wasn't that interested in having a little sister. And number two, I was confused about why don't you just make one for me? And that
how old were you? How old were you at this point?
I was 7 years old.
Oh, okay.
It was the summer of, after I turned 7. I remember coming back to second grade when we came back. And the another one was just kind of an awkward statement my mother made one day as I was about to go out. And she said, "Somebody may tell you that you're not ours, but you are, and it doesn't matter." And I thought that was a very confusing thing, and I didn't understand it. But I went out and I played, and nobody said anything to me. I'm guessing sometime around the time I was 10 years old, maybe, my parents had a fireproof box that they kept documents in. And, some kids go and look in the liquor cabinet. I went and I looked at the fireproof box and I pulled out my father's resumes. I found old high school diplomas for my parents. And there was an envelope in there with my mother's name on it. And I opened it up and there was a document in there and it said it was actually my adoption decree. There were two documents, the adoption decree and something that said certificate of birth by adoption. And this was in New York State, where records back then were sealed. They were sealed until very recently.
Right. Last year, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were no secrets after that. I knew exactly, where I stood. I was listed as male Narowski, which turned out to be my birth mother's name. And, and that decree had 4 names on it. It had both of my adoptive parents. It had their attorney, whose name I for some reason recognized. And it had a woman's name that I did not recognize. But, given the nature of the document, I assumed, okay, that's got to be your birth mother. And
how did you feel about that? Like, how did that make you feel?
I don't honestly remember, Louise. It was nothing that was terribly shocking. I had a great childhood.
But you didn't at that point know you were adopted. So you were 10, you find this box, you see that paper, and now suddenly you're like, oh, I was adopted.
Yeah, it
and
made
all
that
the things
made that
your
awkward
mother.
statement
Yes,
fall into
yes.
place. It made the trip to the orphanage fall into place. But my thought process was my parents had never said anything. And if they weren't saying anything, I guess it was something we don't talk about. So I never brought it up with them. And, my dad died when this is back in 1976.
Yeah.
My birth mother in my adoptive mother in 1987. There was never a word spoken in all that time.
Wow. And you never told them that you found the documents?
No. And, I knew it. And as I said, I had a pretty idyllic childhood. My adoptive parents, I think, loved me and treated me as well as any natural set of parents could have. And
did you ever feel any kind of, I don't know, sort of like you were different or that they weren't DNA matches? You didn't feel any of that, or?
Well, it's other than I was 6 feet tall and they were both 5'2".
Yeah.
So there were some apparent differences. And interestingly, my mother came from a family with she had a brother who was 6'4". And I used to ask about, well, how come you're so short and I'm so tall? And, this is probably a part where, I had already known that I was adopted, but I was still asking about,
seeing what they might say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how do I fit into the family? And she's, well, Uncle Connie was tall, my father was tall, and and it just didn't make a difference to me.
Really? And you didn't later feel any kind of anything like betrayal for not being told, or?
No, there was never any negative feelings there. I would tell you that periodically, but it was infrequent. I would think, gee, who could my mother be?
Yeah.
And it was more of, why would somebody give up somebody like me? And my thought process through that whole thing was, was my mother must have been a high school girl, stayed out late one night, and a couple of months later found out she had a problem.
Yeah.
And I could tell you, I virtually never thought about who my father might be. So, there were those occasional thoughts. And if I probably never thought about it more than once a year or so, if that.
I have to say, when I was young, I never thought about who my father might be either. It was always my mother.
I hear that frequently. Yeah, it's most people are very concerned with their mothers, and the fathers are kind of they're secondary in it.
I had curiosity about both, but I think because I didn't have the closest relationship with my father, so it it was always a wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, and my relationship with my mother and my father was rather different. I think, my mother just, I think, instinctively mothered, and and just made me feel good. My father was a very high expectations kind of person. And, and there's a good stretch where I felt like, gee, I'm really disappointing him. And he was never, it was no cruelty or anything, but, it's always, kind of not measuring up. And, as I got older, I wouldn't say reconciled because there's nothing to really reconcile, but we got onto a much better basis the older I got.
I wonder how many fathers actually put that out on their kids. I think about these things. Like,
I
you don't realize the influence.
I've given that a lot of thought. I think, we talk a lot about the impact of adoption on the mothers. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a big impact on an adoptive father, particularly, because I think something is going on there in his mind that, either I couldn't make a baby or I had this good situation, but now I've got to welcome a baby into my family. I don't know. I just really, I'm not capable of analyzing that.
I wish you could talk to them about it. And how did you come to want to find your birth mother and tell us this story?
Yeah, when you finally decided, okay, I'm adopted. And
it took a whole long time. I really didn't go into it until I was approaching my 70th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's why your story's so unique. It's very interesting.
It is. Mm-hmm. So, we were up in New Jersey. My parents, both of my adoptive parents, were long deceased. My wife's parents had lived in New Jersey, but we had brought them down here to North Carolina just, so my wife could be closer. And if they needed anything, she'd be able to help with that. And as it turned out, both of them arrived in compromised health. And several months later, her mom passed away during the summer. And 6 months later, her dad passed away. And we took their remains back to New Jersey, and we were up there for an internment. And we went to a nearby cemetery where my adoptive mother's family was by and large buried. And we were standing over the grave of my maternal, on the adoptive side, grandparents. And I had this feeling like, wouldn't it be interesting to know more about where they came from? And I think that whole thing was triggered by three things. Number one, I had been reading a book, or I had read it, and I think I was in my third reading of a book called Lost. And it was a book by Daniel Mendelsohn, who went on a search for what happened to 6 of his relatives who perished in the Holocaust.
Yes.
And Mendelsohn got this, big book advance and managed to travel over the whole world, chasing down people who had come from their hometown and stuff, and ultimately found out precisely what happened to them and where it happened. So I was intrigued by that because that was almost a mystery story, but it was real interesting. The other parts were, Ancestry was out there advertising like crazy. Push a button, find everything you ever wanted to know about your family, or take a DNA test and we'll hook you up with everybody. And then the third part was all that those TV shows were out there suddenly where, they were reuniting family, and it just made me curious. So I went to our local. Yes.
Did you still have the papers, by the way? What happened to those papers when your parents died?
When my parents died, that metal box with all the documents came to us. And I had not been in that envelope of my mother's in a very long time. I went to the library when we got back from New Jersey, got on Ancestry, and started typing in my adoptive mother's family's information. And suddenly I'm getting back a lot of things. And
wait, your adoptive mother or your bio mother?
My adoptive at that point.
Oh, you weren't interested in your bio mother at that point?
Well, that's what triggered it.
Okay, because we can find out all the history about our adopted family, but it really has nothing to do with us.
Well, they'd come from Ukraine, and I thought, okay, this is really interesting. And
just history-wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I put in a little bit of information, got these screenfuls back to me, and I sat there for a moment. And I said, if it's really this easy, I said, let me go back, let me get into that metal box, let me open the envelope, get out the document, and let's see what happens. So I literally did that. I got up from the computer at the library, drove the 10 minutes home, and fished out that envelope and took out the document, wrote down the name was Genevieve Irene Norowski, and went back to the library, got onto Ancestry again, and typed it in. I sat there with my finger over the enter button saying, do I really want to do this? Because I wasn't sure what it is that I'm going to find. There's nothing scary about it, but I did. And you're just like with my adoptive family, screenfuls of information, census records. And the one I chose to look at first was an immigration document dated 9 months after I was born, traveling from Miami, Florida to Rio de Janeiro. And I looked at it and I'm thinking, okay, I'm just looking at the title of the document thinking, what could my mother have been doing going to Rio de Janeiro? And for some crazy reason, I think, okay, she's a Eastern European person. I think she's a spy. and so I finally pressed on the button that, the thing was written in Portuguese.
What year was this when she went to Rio?
She went there in March of 1949.
Oh.
I was born in May of 1948. But, so it gave her name. It gave her a street address, which was a 15-minute bus ride from where I grew up.
Wow.
It gave her age. She was 23 when I was born, is what I deduced. So that kind of threw out the high school girl who got into trouble. And it listed her occupation as an artista. Okay, now I'm wondering what's an artista, but the real earth shaker was her picture was there. It was a passport picture. And I'm kind of looking around like, who's watching this? And yeah, there were people there. Nobody would care except for me. And I brought it home to my wife and I showed her. I said, do you want to see a picture of my mother? And she said, we got pictures of your mother all around the house. I think I've seen her. I said, no, this is my birth mother. And that's kind of where this whole thing started and really built momentum.
Wow, it's really, and I wish you had done it earlier, but it's an interesting way how you got to it. Just the investigation process.
Yeah, I'm a believer in things happen for a reason.
Yeah.
And if it was meant to happen in 2017 when it did, that's the case. The unfortunate part is my birth mom died in 2014.
Oh,
so I didn't miss by much. And, and really, we could talk through it some more, but the only real strong feeling I had is I wanted to tell her, you did a good thing. It worked out for the best. And, I'm a believer that she probably knows that. She probably knew it all along.
And what else did you find out? Because you also found your biological dad's side.
Well, I think the interesting thing on my mother's side, just to step back, is, didn't know what kind of an artista she was. I went back to the library and looked some more and found her marriage license from 1955. So this is 7 years after I was born. And she married a man by the name of Ted Meza. And her license listed her name as Genevieve Norowski Norris. And, I didn't recognize Norris, and it listed them both as performers. So it started to, kind of narrow down a little bit, but I got onto Google and tried Meza and I tried Meza, and what I got back was she and her husband had been performers in the big ice shows of the 1940s and 1950s. Ted actually was 20 years older than she was. So he had
still performing? Good for him.
No, but by the end of the 60s.
In all ways.
Yes. So I found a blog, of an antique dealer who had bought a number of items they had produced. When they stopped skating, they went into the business of producing props for the big ice shows. They produced props for the Miss America contest, and they reportedly produced the props for the first Broadway production of Hello, Dolly. So, they were quite accomplished with what they did. Genevieve had gone to high school to a New York City high school, Washington Irving, which was an all-women's school devoted to the arts.
I have a feeling too, back in that, you're talking about the years that it was, for her to have a baby during that time would have totally disrupted her income stream to be an independent person. Absolutely. In that era. So I'm sure it was because she was 23.
And she left you some breadcrumbs. So it sounds like she wasn't
breadcrumbs.
It doesn't sound like she was opposed to being found later in life.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know. The only breadcrumb was that adoption decree. Yeah. And that was, I think, something that my adoptive mother left me. Yeah, she had told my wife, well, if Edward ever wants to go and hunt, he'll be able to, and never said there's a document there with a name on it.
So she was having these conversations with your wife, but not with you?
She had one with my wife. But again, my wife asked more questions than I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's much more inquisitive. And I
Your
think
wife
that,
got in there, like, what's going on?
Yeah, my mother actually brought it up just out of the blue. And my wife, sort of said, does he know that does he know? And she said, well, of course he knows. I told him for 2 years. And but they weren't my memorable 2 years. But yeah, Genevieve left home at the age of 17. She grew up in New York City or just in one of the outlying boroughs. Got on the train one day, and this is not a random act, but she always had an aspiration to be a professional ice skater in the ice shows. Got on a train, traveled alone from New York City to Vancouver, British Columbia, and toured across the United States and into Mexico for the next 5 years until
it's interesting.
Came back pregnant. But we met some people down in Georgia. Another blogger who, when I knew that my mother's name and I put that in as Genevieve Norris ice skater, a blog showed up with all sorts of pictures of hers, her first professional contract, her high school diploma. And, and I tried to get in touch with them, and I did get the woman. She called me back, and I said, I'm exploring possible family relationship. And she said, I'd love to talk to you. I've still got these materials, but I'm busy. I'll call you back. And after a week of waiting, when she didn't call back, I sent a message saying, what you've got is my mother. Please call me. And within 5 minutes, she called and she said, you need to come here right now. And my wife and I traveled, and she had a big carton of photographs and picture albums.
And who was she?
She was, she was a picker. She was in the antiques business. She had been at an auction, and not knowing who my mother was, just saw a glamorous woman from a glamorous era, and she thought it was interesting. And, she paid for this box of stuff.
Oh, that's so crazy.
And happily, she still had it by the time that I met her. And we did travel to Georgia, and when we went down there, we met with she and her husband, and they pushed this box across the table and said, we knew you'd show up one day. This is all yours. We've been holding it for you.
Oh, that's so nice.
It was a wonderful thing. There have been so many generous people along this journey.
And that's such a gift to get. I mean,
it was an absolute gift.
Do you know if she had any other kids, your mom?
Yeah, she did. She had 2 children from the marriage.
So you have siblings?
I have a sibling. One of them is no longer alive. Her first son was born in 1956, and she skated up to that point and then retired. And, he was an interesting story because he took a lot of tracking down. But he was down in Georgia where they had all lived, and I sent one letter. Again, I'm pursuing a possible family relationship. Could you get in touch with me? And it got returned undeliverable, and there were 3 or 4 of those. And finally, from that blog that I mentioned from the picker down in Georgia, I found a comment from somebody who said, I grew up with Genevieve and her husband or his neighbors, and I was best friends with their son.
Wow.
So I reached out to him.
That's on the woman's, that's on the picker.
It was on the picker's blog. Yes.
It's on her blog.
So I reached out to him, and he got back in touch with me, and he explained to me that, this was the first time that I understood my mother was no longer alive. And he said, I sang at her memorial service. And he then told me that about a year later, her son, my half brother, had been in a calamitous fire and was still in a physical and rehab facility. And as it turned out, between hospital and rehab, he had been out of circulation for the better part of 30 months. So he said, I will have Ted call you. And Ted didn't call. So I got back in touch with this person. He said, here's his phone number, call him. And we had a very brief conversation. He said, now explain to me, what kind of kin are we? And maybe underestimating, what kind of a message this is. I said, you and I are half brothers. We have the same mom, you have a different father. And his his response was, I'm not sure how that could be, but I've got to go now because I'm going to take my wife for a walk. And as it turned out, he had married a woman he met in rehab, and she was also still there. He said, but I'll call you back soon. And this was another one that went on for weeks before I heard from him again.
And he did call back.
Yeah. And we had kind of the same conversation again. Yeah,
Well, did you tell him the circumstances of where you were born and all that to kind of?
Yeah, and that didn't
help. It was
help.
Years before he was born.
Yeah, well, that's what I tried to explain to him. I said,
he didn't want to know.
This has nothing to do with you. This has nothing to do with your dad. I said, but yeah, same thing. I don't understand what kind of kin we are. And yeah, so we eventually arranged to go back down to Georgia where he lived and to visit with him. And he was very open to the visit. And we went out to Golden Corral because I thought that was a great place to have an awkward conversation. If it got too awkward, I could go to the chocolate waterfall, and we could go to the salad bar. And, so we had a nice, kind of generic conversation. We had dinner. On the way back in the car, he was sitting in the back seat, and he said, now Cheryl, and Cheryl is his wife, Cheryl wants to know what kind of kin we are.
Oh my gosh. He just couldn't hear that his mom had, a baby.
Yeah. So one more time, so he said, I just don't know how that can be. He said, my mama and my daddy were always together.
Did he have some brain damage in the fire or anything?
I don't think so. No, that's a legitimate question. And people have asked that before.
Well, also because he's in his 60s and saying mommy and daddy. That's the only thing that I was thinking. Like,
yeah, it's mama, and I don't know. But we got back to his apartment. He went back into one of the rooms, and he came out with a big roll of posters.
Wow, cool.
The size of what you would see in a movie lobby, something like that.
Yeah.
And they were all from Holiday on Ice. And he said, he said, their names are right here. And, it listed all the performers, and he went down the 1946 one, and there's his father, Ted Meza, and they're all alphabetical. So he went down looking for Genevieve Norris, and Genevieve wasn't there. I said, Ted, they were not together. And he's not listening. He shook his head. He went to the 1946 poster. We did that again.
He really had a hard time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when we got to the end of 1946, I said, Ted, in 1947, I said, I'm guessing your father was still with Holiday on Ice. Our mother was in San Francisco with Ice Follies. And I was conceived in August of 1947.
Yeah.
And he very deliberately, rolled up the 46 poster, opened up 47, and it was the same story again. And I said it one more time, and without saying anything, he re-rolled all the posters, took them back to where he got them, and came out with a big photo album. And as it turned out, my mother was meticulous in documenting where she had been, dating them, who she was with. Wow. And it was an album full of these little black and white brownie snapshots, all in chronological order, starting in 1942.
Okay.
And he's flipping pages. They're really interesting. I was just salivating looking at all of this. And we got to 1946, and I recognized where she had been because I'd done a lot of research by then. And before he flipped the page, I said, Ted, I said, one more time. I said, our mother was in San Francisco in August of 1947. And I didn't know what was going to be on that next page. But he flipped the page. And again, this is an album full of black and white snapshots. In the middle, I don't know if you can see this. Mm-hmm. Okay. In the middle is the only color photo that was in the entire album. And it's listed as August 1947, San Francisco, California.
Yeah.
And
so then he was convinced. Did he believe you then? Oh my gosh. All right. Ted's got some stuff. So
he folded up the album at that point, put it away, came back, said, would you like a beer? And, we had a nice conversation at that
Do you
point.
like a beer?
At that point, toward the end of the evening, my wife and I were going to go back to the hotel. I had brought a photocopy of the adoption decree. And I said, Ted, I want you to see this. I said, this is my adoption decree. Said it's got my adoptive parents' names on it. It's got their attorney on it. And I said, I'm pretty sure this is our mother. And she had a very distinctive handwriting. There was no doubt. There was no doubt at all. And he looked at it and you could tell it. That's where it registered, but he folded it back up and he handed it to me. And I said, this really has no value other than to me and possibly to you. If you want to keep that, it's fine. So we left him in Georgia. Late that week, he called up again. And, we were talking a lot at that point. And he said, well, I went back down to the rehab facility and showed that paper you gave me to so-and-so, who was the administrator, I think, and somebody he trusted. I said, okay. And there was silence. I said, well, what did he say? He said, well, he asked me if that signature was Mama's. And there was silence again. And I said, what did you say? And he paused. He said, well, I told him that's my Mama's signature. What did he say?
Okay. Well.
And it was just like that. He said, Ted, he said, if that's your Mama's signature, it looks like you've got yourself a brother.
Finally.
And from that day on, there's been no question about it. And he said, I guess just every woman has a secret.
He had a hard time with that. Mm-hmm.
That's what it was. He just could not picture his sainted mother having had a child, because he kept on saying that, he said, my mama would have told me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I don't think so.
Yeah, different times.
Yeah, they were very different times.
Yeah. And then and you had another sibling, but was no longer.
Yeah, he had died under rather unfortunate circumstances. And so he was no longer in the picture. Thankfully, from what I understand from other people and even from my brother Ted, had he been in the picture, this may have been a much more difficult search and reunion.
Yeah.
He was just kind of a difficult character.
And but what about, so your birth father, did you find anything out?
Yeah, as I said, I had never given any thought to who my birth father may have been. And before I began the search for my mother, again, based mostly on Ancestry.com ads, I sent a saliva sample into Ancestry, really just wanting to know what my ethnicity was, not even thinking that it might reveal anybody. And with their Christmas rush back then, it took forever to get it back. I kept on getting emails that, well, your sample's getting closer to the top. We're going to be with you soon. And it was probably in June of that year that I finally got it back.
Wow.
And my first thing that I looked for was the pie chart, because I wanted to know what the ethnicity was. And a lot of Eastern European, which didn't surprise me because I related or I felt close to my Eastern European relatives, once from Ukraine. There was about a third, which was Ashkenazi Jew.
Mm.
And I sort of giggled there because in high school, I had a girlfriend whose mother kept on saying, you're such a nice boy. It's a shame you're not Jewish. And my first thought was, I wonder if a third would have been enough.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Was Genevieve Jewish?
No, she was Polish. They were Roman Catholic. They were Roman Catholic, devout Roman Catholic. And I think that played a great deal with the decision she made.
Sure. Yeah.
Regarding my adoption.
For sure.
And, but then you get the list of your 2,000 closest cousins.
Yeah.
And at the top, there was somebody identified as first cousin, close relative.
Which could mean half sibling.
Yeah. And it's, and there was a name I didn't recognize. And by then I was very comfortable that I knew all the names on Genevieve's side. So I said, well, this is really pretty interesting. I said, this could be on my father's side. And if he's my first cousin, not totally understanding Ancestry's nomenclature at that point, I said, I bet he could tell me who my father is. And, contrary to so many others who have the issue of sending a message and getting nothing back, I sent a ancestry message, and with 10 minutes got an answer back from the person. And and he was elated. He said, "I would love to help you. This is really interesting." And as it turned out, he was a Mormon. And Mormons devote lots of time to their ancestries and genealogy. And he said, "Well, go look at my family tree." And I looked, and I mean, it was immense. But what I really noticed was, his father had no siblings, but his mother had 6 sisters and 1 brother. I said, okay. I said, if this man who I'm corresponding with is my cousin, it's got to be that brother. It's the only, that's his only uncle. And yes, I wrote back and I said, "I think your Uncle Harris is my father. And here's why I think that." And and he probably 10 minutes later, I got another message back, and he said, "Your logic makes total sense." He said, "Uncle Harris was kind of a unique person. And I'll try to tell you more." And another 10 minutes later, I got another message back. He said, I don't think Uncle Harris is your father." He said, "Number one, Uncle Harris never left Texas, and you're sure you were conceived in San Francisco. Also, you're 25% Jewish. Uncle Harris has no Jewish blood." He said, "But I would point out to you that I am 25% Jewish. And my father never left San Francisco." So it was just bingo.
There's my brother.
There's my paternal half brother.
Well, that's a sure different story than your maternal half brother.
This was quick understanding and acknowledgement. And it was kind of poignant because he told me, he said, "I don't know who your adoptive parents were." He said, "But I can tell you, you were better off with them than you would have been with my father as your father." And and he went on with some detail. His dad was kind of a impulsive, compulsive person at the time I was conceived. He was between his second and third of 5 wives.
Yeah.
And so
I wonder how your biological mom hooked up with him.
Well, as it turned out, he was in the insurance business and had close connections with Ice Follies. Every year Ice Follies would get out to San Francisco in June, and they would spend the summer there. They would rehearse their coming season show in the morning. Every night they would perform their current season show for paying audiences. And I'm sure it was just, he saw a good-looking woman, and if he had 5 wives, he must have had some level of charm.
I was just going to say, yeah.
so he dazzled her. He dazzled her. It was
those
interesting.
Slick insurance agents.
Always selling something.
He was selling okay. But his third wife, my half brother's mother, at first was very concerned when he told her about this new development. And then she put the dates together and said, we weren't together at that point. So I guess it's okay.
It's okay. You exist.
But about a year or so later, we went out to visit with my brother just to meet him. And I have the strongest family resemblance to him than I do on the maternal side. And he said, "If you don't mind, my mother would like to meet you." So she was 97, I think, at that point. She's still alive. She's 100 years old now.
Wow.
And she was bright and alert. She had her makeup on. And, we came in and my son was with us. So she greeted my son. She greeted my wife and then told her son, "Take the 2 of them, show them the house. I want to talk to him." And it was kind of, "Sit down. I have things to tell you about your father." And, and it was a very generous thing, I think, because she just felt I had a right to know whatever she could tell me about him. She tried to make it as positive as possible, but, basically said, he had abandoned her and abandoned his son. And she was not very sympathetic about that. You know, she would say that he announced after they were married that Saturdays are mine. She said, I'm sure he went out catting on Saturdays.
Wow.
And, you know, and he always set the schedule. She said, but then she said, but I blame it all on his mother. And she said she was a little mean person. And, you know, so for the little bit that she was able to give me, I thought it was a nice thing. I think it was great that she wanted to share what she knew.
So that no other siblings from him?
No, he was an only child. Well,
but I mean, on Ancestry, there were
that you know.
No,
right, but your father only fathered you and him, nobody else.
That's correct. And I don't honestly believe he even knew I existed.
Right. It doesn't sound like,
it was a summer romance. Genevieve would not have looked back and been in touch with him. And he didn't know. She was long gone by the time she realized that she was pregnant.
And she could probably see who he was too. I'm sure he was.
Oh yeah.
Let it be known who he was.
Yeah. my brother said, you know, if he ever found out that she was pregnant, he would have done everything possible to deny it and to separate himself from the situation.
So are you still in touch with both of your brothers?
Yeah, absolutely. So
that's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you grew up as an only child, right?
I did. I did. So, you know, in its own way, you know, I think I've brought family on my paternal side. And I think, you know, my brother Ted, who's the maternal half brother, really after our mother passed away, was left pretty much on his own. You know, he's got his wife who's in the nursing facility, and, you know, sadly, I'm not sure she'll ever come out of there. She had a fairly severe stroke, and there just isn't aren't the resources to get her out of there and care appropriately someplace else. So, you know, I think I kind of dropped out of the sky to be part of Ted's
system.
Life.
Yeah.
You know, we talked to his wife, was a lovely person. We, you know, when we go there, we visit with her. When we try to call periodically, and just recently had a very nice conversation with her.
That's great. So thank you so much, Ed. I just love your story. And for our listeners, would you please tell the name of your book so that if anybody wants to pop on Amazon and get it?
Yeah, this book, this whole journey turned into a book, and there was never a book intended. I never expected a story, honestly.
I love that you've done this later in life. It's really neat, and have these brothers later in life, and this journey.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful trip. It's been a great thing, and it's, you know, the two brothers could not be any more different than one another. And
sounds like it.
And honestly, I could not be more different than either one of them. But it's been a great.
I'm sure there are some similarities though, just because of you know, DNA is definitely a giant factor here. So,
but if you want the discussion of nature versus nurture, I think nurture won out here.
In your case, that's not the case for everybody.
Oh, that's and I should. Yeah, I think that's, it's not the case for everybody. And again, I think probably as a disclaimer, you know, my search is very different than most people's, because I was gifted, number one, with the identity of my birth mother, and number two, by her career. There was a chronology and
that's so
she could
great.
be followed. She could be identified and where she was and when she was.
I mean, that's just a gift. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
You'll have to send us a picture of her.
Please do.
I'll do that. Yeah. So the book I wrote is called The Gift Best Given. It's a memoir, and it interweaves two stories. It interweaves the story of my search, and it interweaves Genevieve's travels from the time she left home at 17 to the time she returned to New York, known to nobody other than her oldest sister and her sister's husband, to pretty much manage the pregnancy on her own, and then to give birth and place me for adoption without anyone ever having known.
It's a really nice tribute and homage to her, that even though you didn't meet her, it's neat that you've written a book about her journey.
Louise, yeah, that's interesting. When I wrote, my first thought was, I'm just telling a story. And the more I wrote, the more I investigated, and the more I understood, you know, it really is. It became a tribute to her. That's because
neat.
she was a very special person that way.
Sounds like that.
Yeah,
and
the adoption.
Birth mothers could use a little of that too, you know, a little.
Well, she deserved it. And that's why I would love to have seen her and love to have met her, because she did a good thing given the circumstances at the time.
Oh yeah.
She did a good thing. And we recently made contact with the mother-in-law of the brother who's no longer with us. And, and she told me, she said, I don't know how it all worked out. She said, but you did much better than those two boys. And again, I think, I just think it was, it was the nurture side, so I'm very, very grateful for it. But the book is available through any bookstore on order. It can be
Amazon, I'm sure. Yes.
Amazon for sure. Yeah, both in print copy and an ebook. And I do have a website. It's Di Gangi, DIGANGI author.com. And the book can be ordered there. I'm happy to autograph it and personalize it and send it out. And it's people love it when they read it. They've enjoyed the story.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed. It was a delight having you.
Yeah. Thank the both of you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing with the show.
Thank you.
You bring levity to a very serious situation. And I think that's needed. That's a great thing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You bet. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Bye, Ed. Bye-bye.
Bye.